Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another event at the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. We're delighted to have you all here today, and we will be filming today's presentation. So as you may have heard, but for those of you who just came in, if you want to participate in the Q&A, please make sure that you speak into the microphone. It doesn't make any sound in the room, but it helps with our recording so we can preserve our experience here today. So our guest speaker here today is David Livingstone Smith, and David earned his PhD in philosophy at the University of London, King's College, where he worked on philosophy and psychology. His dissertation, in fact, was published as Freud's Philosophy of the Unconscious. To go back and read that. He is a professor of philosophy now at the University of New England, where he teaches courses on philosophy, psychology, philosophy of mind, metaphysics, free will and determinism, philosophy of human nature, philosophy of race, and other topics. He is the author of many groundbreaking works that are both philosophical and interdisciplinary, including the 2012 Anisfield Wolf Book Award-winning Less Than Human: Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others. So we are deeply honored to have him here today to speak with us about his vital research on dehumanization. Please help me in welcoming David Livingstone Smith.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. My worry about giving this talk is that I'm going to try and give you a ridiculous amount of information given the time allotted to me. So I hope I haven't overestimated what I can do here today. Oh, I've got this thing. I don't need to use that. Okay, I want to start with a content warning, more frequently called trigger warnings. I prefer the term content warning. This presentation contains graphic descriptions and depictions of atrocities committed by white Americans against black Americans. So, you know, this is not pretty stuff, but I don't do sweetness and light, and I think it's very important when we talk about these topics to confront them in their raw reality. So here's my plan. I'm going to start by talking about what dehumanization is, which is not a straightforward thing. Then I'm going to give two examples of dehumanization to give you a kind of a more articulated sense of what's involved, what happens on the ground when people are dehumanized. And then I'm going to give you the explanation of the psychology of dehumanization that I presented in my 2011 book, Less Than Human. And finally, I'm going to explain two problems with that view and give you my proposed solution to them. In a way, this is a précis of the book I'm working on now called Making Monsters. So, let's begin. What is dehumanization? Well, this is a term that's thrown around a lot. I mean, a lot of people use it, both in the vernacular. You can Google the word dehumanization and get a gazillion hits. And people are talking about all kinds of things, stretching from the dehumanizing effects of open plan offices to the atrocities at Auschwitz. In the academic world, things are not that much better. There are at least 8 logically distinct senses of the term dehumanization that you find in the literature on social psychology, philosophy, history, and so on. So it's very important to clarify right at the outset what one means when one is talking about dehumanization. Here's what I mean. Dehumanization is conceiving of others as subhuman beings, right? It's a very fine-grained notion. It's not a notion primarily about how we talk about others, although the way we talk about others is obviously something which is symptomatic of our attitudes towards them. It's not about how we treat others, although the way we treat others is also symptomatic of our attitudes towards them, our beliefs. What makes dehumanization, in my account, is how we conceive of others, what we believe about them, what we think about them. A full explanation of dehumanization requires an analysis addressing it from at least 3 dimensions. I mean, this is an interdisciplinary nexus. And to really get a hold of dehumanization, we have to approach it in several different ways. The big three, as far as I'm concerned, are the political dimension, which specifies the content of dehumanization. That is, why at this particular historical moment do members of Group A consider members of Group B as less than human? The cultural dimension, which specifies what I call the character of dehumanization. Why, in this particular instance, is the dehumanized group represented in just this way? Why rats? Why lice? Why predators? Why apes? And so on. And finally, the psychological dimension, which concerns the form of dehumanization. What is it about the human mind that makes dehumanization possible? What is it? How do these cultural and political factors get a grip on us? What is it that in us that they exploit, that enable us to dehumanize others? I talk a bit more about the importance of these 3 dimensions in that paper, Aping the Human Essence, Simionization as Dehumanization, which is in the most recent number of a really wonderful series of books, which is far too little known. It's called the Racism Analysis Yearbook. Anyone who's interested in really good scholarly work on racism really should check that out. I'm going to talk about the psychological dimension today. So, we're on to 2 examples of dehumanization. This was where it gets kind of rough. The 2 examples of dehumanization that I'm going to give are 2 examples that I'm writing about, in fact, in the first chapter of the book in preparation. These are examples of what are called spectacle lynchings. So there's a kind of mythology about lynching in this country, which was that lynching kind of worked like this. At night, some guys in hoods would come, drag some primarily African-American person away and hang them. There were lynchings like that, clandestine lynchings, but there were also these spectacle lynchings. Spectacle lynchings were lynchings which were public events. They were widely advertised. They were attended by thousands of people. In this case, the lynching of Henry Smith, between 10 and 20,000 people. Railroad companies laid on excursion trains to transport people to the festivities. Professional photographers were present, made photographs, they sold them as postcards. They were very, very popular. And it wasn't a scene of hanging, which is the cliche about lynching. In the spectacle lynchings, typically the victim was tortured, really in the most gruesome manner imaginable, and then burnt alive, and typically burnt slowly. In such a way as would prevent them being asphyxiated by inhaling smoke, so to extract the maximum amount of pain. So Henry Smith was this mentally handicapped guy, a black guy who lived in Paris, Texas. He was 27 years old, and he was accused of murdering and raping. Rape was always thrown into these things, a 4-year-old child. And he was apprehended and dragged. This is an actual photograph of the lynching. So you see, this is a small section of the crowd of 20 to 20,000 people. He's up on that platform. You can't read it here, but it says justice, ironically, on the platform. And here's what happened to Smith, as reported in the New York Sun. His clothes were torn off piecemeal and scattered in the crowd, people catching the shreds and putting them away as mementos. The child's father, that's the murdered child, her brother and 2 uncles then gathered about the Negro as he lay fastened to the torture platform and thrust hot irons into his quivering flesh. It was horrible, the man dying by slow torture in the midst of smoke from his own burning flesh. Every groan from the fiend, every contortion of his body was cheered by the thickly packed crowd of 10,000 persons, the massive being 600 yards in diameter, the scaffold being the center. After burning the feet and legs, the hot irons, plenty of fresh ones being at hand, were rolled up and down Smith's stomach, back, and arms, and then the eyes were burnt out and irons were thrust down his throat. And this is before he was burnt to death. This was not an unusual treatment. Lynching of Sam Hose, 1899. Sam Hose was a 21-year-old farm worker. He was accused of murdering his employer with an axe, raping his employer's wife, and harming the children. A description. The rough stuff is going to be over soon. The clothes were torn from the Negro in an instant. A heavy chain was produced and wound around his body. Instantly, a hand grasping a knife shot out, and one of the Negro's ears dropped into a hand ready to receive it. He pleaded pitifully for mercy and begged his tormentors to let him die. His cries were unheeded. Before the torch was applied to the pyre, the Negro was deprived of his ears, fingers, and genital parts of his body. He pleaded pitifully for his life while the mutilation was going on, but stood the ordeal of fire with surprising fortitude. About 4,000 people came to Newnan, Georgia, which just outside of Atlanta, for this event. So, Smith and Hose, and many others. Smith and Hose were described as subhuman animals. So here are some excerpts from literature of the day. A black beast, the San Antonio Gazette. Bestial Negro, the St. Louis Gazette. A subhuman being in human shape, Early, that was a man who wrote an eyewitness account of the lynching of Smith. The victim, Smith's victim, was, quote, torn asunder in the mad wantonness of guerrilla ferocity. Bishop Haygood, he was a bishop. Devoid of any humanizing sensibilities, Vance. Black brute whose carnival of blood and lust has brought death and desolation, fiendish beast, cited in Dre, 2003. Dre's book, by the way, if you're interested in lynching, is very, very fine. It's called At the Hands of Persons Unknown, The Lynching of Black America. Highly recommended. Okay. They were also treated as subhuman animals. So they were described and treated as subhuman animals. One example is the trophy collection. I'll quote from the report in the Springfield Republican. Small pieces of bone went for 25 cents, and a bit of the liver, crisply cooked, sold for 10 cents. As soon as the Negro was seen to be dead, there was a tremendous struggle among the crowd, which had witnessed his tragic end, to secure the souvenirs. A rush was made for the stake, and those near the body were forced against it and had to fight for their freedom. Knives were quickly produced, and soon the body was dismembered. Hose's ears, nose, and penis, which were cut off before the fire started, were especially prized, and a set of his knuckles were displayed in the window of an Atlanta grocery store. That's, if you know much about W.E.B. Du Bois, this was a turning point for Du Bois. He was actually walking through Atlanta where he worked, and he was going to visit the editor of the Atlanta Constitution about, I believe, publishing an article for them. And on his way, he read in the newspaper that on the very street he was walking, Sam Hose's knuckles were being displayed in the window of a grocery store. And he realized at that moment that when it came to race, one could not be a disinterested academic. One had to take a stand. One had to be an activist. Lynchings where black people were burned were referred to as barbecues. All right, so think on that for a moment. So as Orlando Patterson points out, at these lynchings, the crowd, who, by the way, the crowd for Hose's lynching were fresh out of church. It was Sunday morning. They poured out of the churches and went to the lynching. They were imbibing the smoke, the smell of burning flesh. Children who were brought to these lynchings repeatedly, because this was like a family outing, this was a barbecue, were accustomed to the smell of burning flesh. Patterson really calls it a kind of act of cannibalism. And I think he's justified in saying that. Okay, so they were both described as subhuman animals, and in certain obvious and striking respects, treated as subhuman animals are treated. Barbecued, having trophies extracted from them, and some of these trophies were retained for decades afterwards. I mean, I won't burden you with more grisly stuff, but there's other stuff I could tell you. Okay, but not only were they described as subhuman animals, and this is going to prove to be important, they were also described as demons and monsters. Some examples: incarnate monster from the New Orleans State, unnatural monster from the Texarkana News, the most inhuman monster known in current history, the New York Sun, fiend incarnate, Vance, monster in human form, cited in that great book by Dre. So, I've told you what dehumanization is in my view. I've given you these two examples, give you the feel of it. Now I want to spend a little bit more time than I have on either of those two, just keeping track of time, as I said the word time, to explain to you the account of dehumanization that I gave in my 2011 book. The account of the psychology of dehumanization. What's going on under the hood when sane people, these were sane people, these people weren't mad. They were ordinary, everyday people, which is very often the case. You know, this is very, very important. A psychologist who examined the Germans brought to justice at the Nuremberg trials remarked that they were pretty much the sort of people you'd meet in an average PTA meeting. They weren't insane. One of them tried to pretend to be insane, you know, for to cover his own ass, but they weren't insane. So, I'm going to start by using these two texts, separated in time and space. So the first one is a really wonderful book. It was written by an awesome guy named Morgan Godwin. It's called The Negroes and Indians Advocate, Suing for Their Admission into the Church, or, and you know, it's got one of those long 17th century titles, right? So Godwin was this Anglican clergyman who came from, he was, by the way, a student of John Locke's in England, and he went to Barbados and then to Virginia, and he campaigned against atrocities perpetrated against African slaves and Native Americans, but primarily he campaigned against atrocities against African slaves. And he had some wonderful, wonderful arguments. He was really, really sharp and fearless guy. And so this is one of his several books in which he's reporting on the attitudes towards black people in the late 17th century in Virginia and Barbados. This is from the 1940s. This tasteful little piece is called Der Untermensch, which was a pamphlet published by the SS in Germany just prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union. Der Untermensch means the subhuman, and it's all about the subhuman races, especially Jews. So this rather sinister-looking character is like the paradigmatic Jew, and it's all about how evil Jews are and how they commit mass atrocities and stuff like that. So what you're going to see is there are these uncanny similarities between the way the 17th century colonists dehumanized black people and Nazis in the mid-20th century dehumanized Jews. So there's Morgan Godwin. I think it's the only known portrait of him. And there's Heinrich Himmler. I put Himmler because Himmler was the general editor of that pamphlet. So let's start. Oops, what did I do? There we go. Start here. It's a quote from Godwin. Remember, Godwin is reporting. He's a good guy. He's not a bad guy. He's a good guy. The Negroes, though in their figure they carry some resemblances of manhood, yet are indeed no men. That was the view. So if we turn that into contemporary American vernacular, he's saying the colonists thought black people looked like human beings, but weren't really human beings. Now, compare this to Himmler. Not all of those who appear human are in fact so. Woe to him who forgets it. So once again, there's this contrast between how beings appear and what they really are deep down inside. Godwin again. Africans are creatures destitute of souls, to be ranked among brute beasts and treated accordingly. So there's kind of a metaphysical explanation of the subhuman status of black people in the eyes of the white slaveholders. They lack a soul, which was supposed to then, I mean, that was the theory, what makes you a human being? The possession of a rational soul. And there's this notion of rank here as well. So in virtue of being destitute of a soul, they are ranked, their proper place is with the subhuman animals, the brute beasts. And then that licenses a certain sort of treatment that we saw in the cases of Henry Smith and Sam Hose. Yeah?
What does brute do to them?
I don't know. I don't know if there's a difference in sense between brute and beast, because it does just seem repetitious, doesn't it?
The history of the noble beast.
Okay. Okay, so a brute beast, it's a derogatory characterization of the beast.
Sort of medieval, post-medieval.
Okay. Okay, good, thank you. Himmler again. Although it has features similar to a human, the subhuman is lower on the spiritual and psychological scale than any animal. And that's very interesting that he says actually lower than an animal. We'll come back to that. Jews are beasts in human appearance. So, you know, I trust you'll be struck by the uncanny similarity between these characterizations. I use them because these are two exceptionally explicit descriptions. But we can find many similar things in accounts of dehumanizing attitudes throughout history and throughout geography. Okay, so in brief, the account that I gave in Less Than Human of the psychology of dehumanization, which is nicely illustrated by those quotations, is that it involves three components. The first is what's known as psychological essentialism. And that's the view which comes very, very easily to us. And there's a really nice literature in psychology on this, starting from about 1989. It's quite large now. It's the tendency which comes quite easily to us to think of things as follows. A thing's appearance is merely indicative, not constitutive of the kind of thing that it is. And this applies to what we think of as natural kinds, that is, sort of objective categories out there in nature. So the appearance of a thing we don't think of that as making it the kind of thing that it is. The appearance of a thing is simply a sign or an indication of what it is. So to illustrate that, you know, we could use my favorite example. Well, what makes a porcupine, according to sort of the folk biological essentialist views? Well, it's not that it's got quills or it's brown or it has four legs, because there are three-legged porcupines and albino porcupines and presumably mutant non-quilly porcupines. We think of porcupines, what constitutes being a porcupine, being a member of that natural kind porcupine, is some inner porcupininess, which we vaguely, you know, think, it's in their blood or in their tissues or something like that, or nowadays in their genes. People who know nothing about genetics are very fond of invoking genetics in that fashion. So that's the idea of psychological essentialism. How a thing appears and what it really is can come apart, because the appearance is merely a symptom of the essence. Second, the notion of rank kinds, also known as the great chain of being. This is the idea that natural kinds are ordered on a hierarchy in accord with their supposed intrinsic value. Those kinds ranked below the human are subhuman. So this is often treated as kind of a formal metaphysical framework which was developed in late antiquity and proliferated in the Middle Ages right up through maybe the late 18th century. That's true, but that's not all it is. It's a feature of our moral psychology. People engage in this ranking process, even people who know better, even biologists who know all about the theory of evolution will talk about higher animals and lower animals. It comes so easy to us. And I think it comes easy to us because it's really, the basic idea is a necessary condition of any kind of moral system whatsoever. We have to make distinctions between what sorts of actions are permissible to take with respect to one kind of thing as opposed to another kind of thing. Otherwise, we simply can't have a moral system. So this ranking, we find different versions in different cultures, but as far as I've been able to determine, we find it all over. It's not a formal philosophical artifact by any means. Finally, ambivalence. I think it's a almost necessary condition for dehumanization, that there be present both inhibitions against and the desire to benefit from violence, killing, oppression, exploitation, and so on. So dehumanization is something that happens when we're kind of between a rock and a hard place, when it's attractive to us to harm others or to benefit from others harming others, but we confront our own kind of gut inhibitions against doing that. It's a solution to a problem, the problem of paralysis in those circumstances. It's not the only solution. So if you look at the history, particularly of warfare, throughout history, people have resorted to all sorts of means to disinhibit themselves. Drugs, alcohol, rituals to produce altered states of consciousness. There are all sorts of means that have been used. Dehumanization is just one of these. Oops, go back. No. Okay. So that's the picture in 2011 book. Let's run through it again very, very quickly. It's attractive to us and problematic for us to harm others for our own gain. Dehumanization is kind of a psychological process or gimmick that allows us to disable these inhibitions so as to engage in acts which would otherwise be psychologically very difficult for most of us to engage in. Not all of us. I mean, some people don't care about harming others. But that's the exception rather than the rule. So it's our capacity to essentialize, to make the distinction between how people look and what they are, that allows us to make the following move. Although they may look like human beings, remember the quotations, really on the inside where it counts, they are subhuman creatures, creatures of a lower rank. That's the hierarchical notion, the great chain of being. And thus, we're free from certain moral obligations to them or certain inhibitions that we would naturally have to our own kind, and can treat them in ways which we would regard as impermissible to treat our own kind. What's wrong with that? Well, a couple of things. Two problems. Here's the first, and it's been mentioned by several people. Kwame Appiah, the philosopher, Kate Mann, the philosopher, Adam Gopnik, I guess you'd call him a man of letters, and actually Morgan Godwin, because let me go through it and I'll explain just very briefly the way Godwin tackled this. Appiah says, the persecutors may liken the objects of their enmity to cockroaches or germs, but they acknowledge their victims' humanity in the very act of humiliating, stigmatizing, reviling, and torturing them. Such treatments and the voluble justifications the persecutors invariably offer for such treatment is reserved for creatures we recognize to have intentions and desires and projects. In other words, there's an implicit and sometimes explicit acknowledgement of the humanity of the victims of these atrocities, while at the same time, the perpetrators characterize them as subhuman beings. So there's something complicated going on here. Godwin, the way Godwin did this, of course, he wasn't talking about the psychology of dehumanization because the idea wasn't around in 1680 when he wrote that piece. But he gives these arguments like, well, you say they're subhuman animals, but you rape them. Like, how would you like to be indicted for sodomy? You know, how do you square these two things? So he too pointed out this tension between the dehumanization and the implicit acknowledgement of humanness. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, the account in Less Than Human does not explain why dehumanized people are, it should be are, not our, often represented as demons or monsters. So it's all about subhuman animals in there, not demons and monsters. So now I want to explain how I deal with these two objections, which I think has really improved my account of dehumanization, deepened it in all sorts of ways. Let's keep track of time again. Okay, I'm doing okay. Well, let's start with this. That's a rat, obviously. Now, you might have all kinds of attitudes towards rats. You might detest them, you might like them. If you're a psychology student, you might prepare them. But, you know, there are lots of possibilities here. That's not a rat. That's kind of a rat, but it's got a human head. That's actually a Danish poster from the 40s, an anti-Semitic poster. I believe the translation is "Rats Destroy Them." So this is a body of a rat with a Jewish man's head, a kind of chimera. Now, how would you react if you saw something like that? It would be rather different than if you saw something like that. There's something very disturbing about this if we take it out of the context of this cartoon-like figure and imagine actually encountering a fusion of rat and human being. This territory, the reaction that I think any human being really and truly, if they saw something like that creature on the Danish propaganda poster would have, was first explored by this man. This is a man named Ernst Jentsch, and he wrote this really seminal paper in 1906 called Zur Psychologie des Unheimlichen, which is conventionally translated on the psychology of the uncanny. My phone is buzzing, which is irritating. Okay, on the psychology of the uncanny. And so what Jentsch was interested in is what goes on when we have this feeling that the Germans referred to by this word unheimlich. Now, like I said, unheimlich is conventionally translated as uncanny when translating the title of this paper, but that actually doesn't quite do it justice. Because uncanniness in English is just, you know, something can be uncanny without being disturbing. It can even be delightful. It's just unusual. But unheimlich, in most contexts, is disturbing. It's kind of creepy. It's kind of makes your flesh crawl. So I prefer to think of this as on the psychology of creepiness rather than the uncanny. In fact, I've just published an article about this. And what Jentsch argued was, we experience this feeling of creepiness when we can't settle on a categorization of something. So the one thing seems to belong to two mutually exclusive categories. So one of his prime examples is figures in a wax museum. That was a high-tech, example in 1906. So you go into a wax museum, and I think we can still relate to this. So there's a human figure, say, representing Barack Obama. And at first glance, man, it looks like the guy. It's so well done. But then you look and it's not quite there. The eyes are dead, the skin is a little waxy, there's no movement, there's no facial expression. And that gives us a different kind of signal. This is a lump of inanimate matter. As long as we're torn between the disposition to classify that as a person and classify it as a lump of inanimate matter, we're creeped out by the thing. So he gives the example of corpses as well. So the corpse is the dear departed, a human being, but it's also a slab of cold meat, right? And as long as we can't settle on one of these, we experience this feeling of uncanniness. So that's uncanny because it's giving us signals of two very different kinds of things. In this case, human and non-human. I think that cleaned up a little bit, made a little bit more rigorous. Jentsch was really on the right track here. Jentsch's work was pretty much forgotten about. Apart from Freud's, I believe it was 1918 paper called The Uncanny, until 1970. In 1970, Masahiro Mori, who was is a Japanese roboticist, published a very short paper in an obscure journal. I believe it was called Energy. And the title of that paper is Bukimi no Tani Gensho. Since the 1980s, that's been translated as The Uncanny Valley. Bukimi, I've asked Japanese speakers about Bukimi. Creepy. It's creepy. So we could call it the Valley of Creepiness. That's an alternative translation, which is pretty creepy translation, right? So he basically, without mentioning Jentsch, and I don't even know if he knew about Jentsch, proposed something very similar in the context of robotics. Basically, what Mori suggested is, as we try to make robots, and by the way, prosthetic limbs, he also talks about that, more anthropomorphic, more human-like, we get more and more comfortable with them until they're almost indistinguishable from a human being, but not quite, like the figure in the wax museum. When that happens, the level of familiarity plunges into the valley of creepiness, right? And would only ascend when the robot is indistinguishable from a human being. So Mori rediscovers this same notion. Two other very important contributors are Mary Douglas, her 1966 book, Purity and Danger, and Noel Carroll, philosopher, who wrote a great book called The Philosophy of Horror. And Carroll draws on Douglas. Douglas, as far as I can determine, was working totally independently of Jentsch. But Douglas is interested in this. She's interested in how any cultures have this notion of the natural. That every culture has this framework of the categories that are supposed to constitute the natural kinds that are specific to that culture. But the problem is the world doesn't ever completely fit into these things. There are always these anomalies, these things that don't quite correspond. And Douglas argues, this is embedded in a much larger argument, and actually kind of confusing argument, that these items which don't fit in, they're obviously by definition unnatural, and they're experienced as impure, polluting, abominable, and must be mastered, segregated, and so on and so forth. Carroll, who draws on Douglas, argues that monsters in horror fiction are contradictory beings. That is, they're beings that transgress metaphysical boundaries. They're human and wolf, or they're a person with a demon inside them. They're these odd, contradictory fusions. That makes them what he calls cognitively threatening, right? So drawing on Douglas, he says, look, things that don't fit into our framework of the natural are cognitively threatening. They're disturbing. A monster has to have an additional element, though. A monster has to be both cognitively threatening and physically threatening. It poses a physical danger as well as a metaphysical danger. So let's now bring it back to dehumanization. I propose that when we dehumanize others, our mind is pulled in two incompatible directions at once. That's Appiah's observation. On the one hand, we respond to these others as human beings because we can see that they're human beings. The observation, as hypersocial animals, we're very sensitive to the physical cues, particularly the facial cues that indicate humanness. But they're non-observationally, theoretically classified as subhuman beings, often through mechanisms like propaganda, right? So on one hand, we're encountering the other and we're responding to them as human beings. On the other hand, we're classifying them on an entirely different basis as subhuman beings. So we're in that kind of situation described by Jentsch and Douglas and Carroll. Hence, dehumanization virtually always fails. That is, it's virtually always the case that we fail to convince ourselves that the other person is just a subhuman animal. Rather, we end up creating a monster. We create a monster because we can't escape simultaneously regarding them as human, simultaneously, right? The dehumanized other is then felt to be not simply a subhuman animal, but a creepy, Unheimlichen, unclean, demonic, or monstrous being. Yeah?
I take it you say because it's monstrous, it both has, it then remains capable of intentionality and...
Correct.
Right, and that's the thing that you need for it to have.
Yes, that's right. And monstrous because if we go back to the circumstances in which people are dehumanized, and this is a bit of an oversimplification of my theory because I can use this to develop a taxonomy of different sorts of dehumanization. It's very typical that the dehumanized population is seen as dangerous, right? So that's the physical danger plus the cognitive danger creates the monster.
But there's a deserved framework that they deserve it because they intend to be threatened.
Yes.
Sort of threatening in a way that lying or other...
That's right, that's right. That's right, exactly. Okay. Why dehumanization fails? Briefly, in my view. There's some really fascinating, relevant literature on this. We're a hypersocial species. Consequently, we are highly responsive to perceptual indications of humanness, especially human faces. This responsiveness is difficult, if not impossible, to turn off. So as much as we try, and a lot of the phenomenology of dehumanization involves the persecutors really trying to convince themselves that these others are really just subhuman beings, really put them in their place. And there are all sorts of practices that are designed to do that. For instance, think of the practice of, in the United States, slaveholders feeding slaves out of hog troughs, right? It's like, I'm going to put you in your place, both socially and metaphysically. Because if you were just an animal, you wouldn't be so scary. Okay. Paradoxically then, it's our inability to think of other human beings as nothing but animals that is responsible for the worst horrors of dehumanization. And I think this is a particularly striking pair of images. That's the Dutch, it's a movie poster for the Dutch version of the German propaganda film, which some historians think convinced Hitler to undertake the final solution, the eternal Jew, represented here, and the, the paradigmatic, super predatory African-American youth here. So to recapitulate, when we dehumanize others, we conceive of them as subhuman animals, possessing a subhuman essence. This cannot be sustained because of our psychological responsiveness to indications of humanness. Consequently, we classify dehumanized others as simultaneously human and subhuman, This makes them cognitively threatening. Insofar as they are also believed to be physically threatening, they are experienced as monstrous or demonic. Thank you. I'm happy to supply unsatisfactory responses to questions.
Oh, we have the microphone. Hold on. Excuse me. Who first?
Well, Tony's right here.
Thanks very much. Fascinating. There was a particular thought that it just occasioned in me at the end that really made me pause, which is that the people who are engaging in the dehumanizing, it rather switches one's view of them. So that they're, in a sense, maybe not, their intention isn't so evil, as it were, as what the effect of their language is.
Yeah. 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 Of course, their intentions are pretty bad. They want to oppress and harm people, but the project isn't to make monsters, it's to make animals. And when you get that inadvertent and unanticipated effect of creating monsters, yes, things, I think, get much, much worse.
Yeah, could you just pass that, I think, to the right there? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this. Wait, is this on?
Yeah, it won't sound in the
Okay.
room, but
No.
we're
Okay.
recording. Thank you.
So the question I have is that I'm actually doing a lot of similar research, but my research comes from the opposite direction, and it explores the intersection of the monstrous and the erotic, wherein like this sort of uncomfortable place is also a place of desire, a place of wanting to either be the thing that is
Yeah.
dehumanized or like mate with the
Yeah.
thing that is dehumanized.
Yeah.
So could you speak on that?
Yeah, only a little bit. It's something that I really want to explore. I mean, it's so salient in the lynching cases. It's so salient, and the conceptual territory. Now, there, Freud's paper on the uncanny has something to say, because, in his view, what makes something uncanny, I mean, he's with Jentsch that it's both familiar and strange, is that we see in someone or something else something which belongs to us, but which we've disowned. So really, without bullshitting, which I don't like to do, that's as far as I could get with that one. I think it's a really important topic.
So, one of the questions I had, can the sort of idea of the subhuman exist without there being a tension on the opposite side with the idea of the superhuman, right? Do you have to have the Übermensch along with the idea of the Untermensch in the same sort of dialogue? Because, I mean, one of the arguments is part of what has to drive the dehumanization is a certain amount of self-loathing, a sense of insecurity and self-awareness that you yourselves are not necessarily as superior as you could be, but at least there is a sense in which you are not the Unter, but you can reach and desire or are capable of becoming Uber in that sense.
I don't know. The Unter and Uber are relative to one another. Well, not the. I mean, the Mensch is Uber, right? Just being a Mensch is Uber with respect to the Untermensch, right? There is, I think, a mechanism something like that. So there are cases, say, particularly in warfare, where the disinhibition is achieved not so much by denigrating the enemy as subhuman, but as elevating oneself to superhuman. And superhuman in its a specifically moral sense, right? It's a question of value. There's some confusion around this by the way, in the psychological literature, primarily terminological confusion. So there's this idea that came out not too long ago called the superhumanization bias. There was an article, it was popularized under the heading, "White People Think Black People Are Magical." right? I think the term superhumanization is misleading because it sounds like the opposite number to dehumanization. If you read the material carefully, it's a form of dehumanization. So you see, it's not about superior intrinsic value, it's about maybe superior strength or sexual voraciousness or something like that. And that's very common. I mean, it's very, very common. It's quite usual to see a dehumanized population as a remarkably formidable enemy that needs to be destroyed. That's part of the turning of them into monsters.
Got it. The microphone's over there. Go ahead.
Thanks for your talk. And I'm just going to paraphrase how I understand the psychological mechanism so that you can find it acceptable.
Yeah.
In dehumanizing, we see the dehumanized as an other, and because of the inability to see them as subhuman, we see them as this amalgamation, and that makes them kind of demonized.
Yeah. So I just need to tune it a little bit.
Great.
Okay. Right. So it's not just that they're other; they're categorically other, a different kind. Right. So, you know, you could be other because you live in Illinois rather than Ohio, right? But categorically other. And categorically inferior, right? So it's not that we can't see them as animals. It's while classifying them as animals, we can't help also seeing them as humans. So we got the two things going at once, and that's what produces the strange kind of monstrous fusion, right?
Categorically other and inferior, but you can't see them as only subhuman.
That's right. Both gas and the brakes are on, right?
And so to me, it means that necessarily like the group that is not being dehumanized has to be seen as like homogenous and at least definitely categorically different from the other. And so so in our country, such a heterogeneous population, so I'm wondering your opinion, how do you think such rampant Islamophobia happens?
Well, rampant Islamophobia happens largely through propaganda that we receive. Islamophobia, like racism, most often falls short of dehumanization in my strict sense of the word. So you can think of others as morally inferior human beings without thinking of them as subhuman human beings. Of course, in some cases of Islamophobia, it does go to that, right?
Thank you. Can you pass, we'll go kind of back and forth, so if you pass it down this way and then we'll kind of, please be patient and don't forget your question.
Thank you. So you mentioned part of the reason why dehumanization fails is because of this human, inherently social interaction that we have with other humans.
Yeah.
So as technology advances and we are able to connect with people across the world with this barrier of the internet, do you think that will kind of let dehumanization actually maybe continue or even get easier as technology advances?
I don't know. I mean, my gut reaction is it's not likely to make a difference. If we're motivated to think of others as less than human, and we're confronted with, well, no, maybe you're right there. So in the past, when it was often the case that people were dehumanized by people who actually never encountered them and never could encounter them, right? So with the remarkable increase in accessibility through technology, I think virtually all of those whom we in the developed world, in any case, might be inclined to dehumanize, we can also encounter, receive the cues of humanness, and therefore make monsters perhaps more readily. I don't like that conclusion, but...
I know, that sounds depressing.
Fascinating presentation. Thank you. I'm thinking about the relationship between dehumanization and demonization.
Yes.
And I think the issue is highly complex. Well, there is a theological concept of demonization, according to which the archdemon is a fallen angel. Fallen angel. Now, how does that come about? Well, the angel freely chose to rebel against God. Okay, so a demon is not someone or some being to whom an inferior status is given. It is chosen. Demonic nature is chosen. Now, so one point that I can make as a kind of critical point is this: demonization is not dehumanization. Perhaps it is viewing a person as fallen by free will. Now, the attitude of a person toward a demon is first envy, because the demon appears as a courageous anti-hero hero. Okay, and second reaction, or second aspect of the reaction, is fear that the one might become a demon, because the freedom to rebel against God or against the idea or whatever is a possibility. It is an existential possibility. Now, we can perhaps leave the theological realm and look at the phenomenological ontology, such as that of Sartre. Sartre has that. Kierkegaard talks about the alluring prospect of choosing something that is evil, and so on. I think the point that I can contribute to the discourse is the following. That is, we need a kind of refined ontology of human beings to really understand what demonization is, what dehumanization is. It is not a criticism of your view.
I'd be fine if it was.
Yeah, the discourse. My feeling is that the discourse has to be expanded, and perhaps it needs more complex structuring. Thank you.
Okay, so, I mean, I'll respond. First of all, I don't see a particular theological doctrine about the chief demon, right? Lucifer. I'm not sure what the status of the various other demons are, even within that theological tradition. Yeah, okay. That, I don't think, bears on conceptions of demons generally outside of that tradition. And I don't think it bears well on the cases, say, that I presented, where these human beings were described as demons. Because these human beings were thought of as demonic to the bone. So it's not that they almost heroically chose to rebel against the good. These were beings who, as young black males are often treated in this country today, are seen as essentially, well, I'll say essentially demonic, and by essentially demonic I mean malevolent, without conscience, and irredeemably so, right? So I mean, it's an interesting analogy, but I think it fails us when we're trying to understand the sorts of phenomena that I'm trying to understand here.
Yeah, I'm pretty aware of the semantic ambiguity of
Yeah.
demonstrations.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. This has been an absolutely fascinating talk. And I'm wondering, a question that picks up a little bit on Professor Kim's, but also on the conversation yesterday after Sabrina Smith's talk. Do you see this psychological mechanism, which is psychological, cultural, and political, as transhistorical, Or do you see what you're doing as complementary to someone like Foucault, for example, who would say that a lot of the phenomena we're seeing are specifically modern outcomes of a congruence between the law, technology, medicine that make it possible for some people to be put in a role which is not maybe metaphysically evil, but contagious, or degenerate. That there is a specific modern scientific aspect that goes into the creation of these notions of the subhuman and the dangerous to human life.
Well, yeah, in a sense, both. So when I was researching Less Than Human, I did find stuff in the ancient world.
Okay.
Ancient China, Mesopotamia, Egypt, which looked an awful lot like dehumanization. Okay. That doesn't mean it's transhistorical. Okay. And until we study this phenomenon a lot more, we're not going to be able to answer that question intelligently. So here's my take. Dehumanization, like race, is not simply a product of the last 400 years, right? I think that those who say that about notions of race are incorrect, and those who say it about dehumanization are incorrect. So there's one view which you read occasionally, is that really dehumanization is a product of 18th century ideals of human equality, because those then conflicted with the economic incentives of colonization and slavery. I don't think that's right when put so strongly. I think different eras and different cultures place very distinctive stamps on the dehumanizing process. That's what I was trying to get at by the cultural component of those three components. But until we understand more, I think we just have to be agnostic about to what degree dehumanization is culturally contingent.
Thank you. Is it all right if I ask a question and make a more extended comment? The question should be simple.
Of course.
Okay. My question is, do you see the process of creating monsters, of demonization, do you see that as an alternative to dehumanization, or is it a process that facilitates dehumanization?
I'd like to make a distinction between, no, it doesn't facilitate dehumanization. It depends how fine-grained we want to be semantically. So there are two phases involved here. The one is rendering or attempting to render the other as a subhuman animal. And then there's the consequence of that inevitably failing, which turns them into demons and monsters, right? I'm inclined nowadays to refer to that whole package as dehumanization. And if I want to distinguish the first phase, I sometimes call it dehumanization proper.
That makes sense. As for my comment, I originally wanted to ask you about a thing in your 2011 book in the 7th chapter that's stuck with me all these years. Uh-huh. There's a bit at the end where you sort of jokingly referred to the absurdity of putting Count Dracula on trial.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, I think that the only absurdity there would be whether Hungary or Turkey or Romania would have jurisdiction over him. And what that leads me to is, and what I was originally going to ask you about was the ease with which, in works of fiction with mythical monsters and creatures, the ease with which we treat creatures that seem to be intelligent and personable, and then we turn them into fearsome things that have to be destroyed and that are essentially not like us. And what that has led me to, after hearing your talk here, is that I do think that the process of turning people into monsters makes it easier for us to no longer see them as human, but to also see them as subhuman animals. Because then someone can look at the face of a black person or a Jewish person, and they look for all of these stereotypical features on their faces, and they say, oh, this person is not like me. Maybe they aren't really as human as me. And from there on, it's a slide down into the depths of dehumanization.
Well, yeah, but only insofar as there's some kind of tension that would encourage that process, right? So dehumanization, a view that I'm very strongly opposed to is that it's just kind of a consequence of noticing that people are different. Noticing difference is very far from dehumanization, right? That in itself is not sufficient either for antipathy or for conceiving of someone as categorically other. Yeah, that's right. That's right. The relationship between Native Americans and English colonists in Virginia is a very good example of that very early on. It's a racialization example, but racialization follows the same pattern. In fact, I think that racialization virtually always precedes dehumanization. It's the halfway house. So initially, the English colonists described Native Americans as white. And they thought, well, yeah, their skin's a little bit different. That's the sun or stuff that they put on it. And then they became tawny. And this goes right in line with increasing tensions between the two populations. And then they became red, right? Then they were racialized then. They were savages. You had these anti-miscegenation rules coming in and so on and so forth. So it's the political facts on the ground that can exploit phenotypic differences to produce racialization and dehumanization.
Would you mind running the mic to the other side of the house? or here if it's still, but we just need to keep it moving.
Okay. Thank you for the discussion. I was wondering about the historical context of dehumanization and how we tell those stories today. So things in concerning lynchings like historical markers or museums that preserve artifacts, and maybe people today who haven't necessarily encountered those forms of dehumanization like firsthand, but are able to learn about them. What is the role, like artifacts and other things that are part of the dehumanization, and how do we learn from those to help combat it? Or maybe these things can be used to probably teach dehumanization more today, depending on how they're utilized.
Well, yeah, I mean, you ask what is the role, and I'm not equipped to answer that question. I think they should be used. I think people in this country, and presumably, well, I know in Great Britain it's the same. People in this country are just horribly ignorant of the horrors of history. The Americans have come nowhere near to facing up to their national crimes. Nowhere near. And anything that will facilitate that, what makes it possible to do, I think will have a very, very beneficial effect with respect to dehumanization and a whole bunch of other things. But I can't give you, I don't have the expertise to give you a better response than that. There are groups trying to do these things with respect to lynchings. They're still meeting a lot of resistance. There's like a Truth and Reconciliation group specifically concerned with lynching. And yeah, they're not always welcomed with open arms. There's something we want to really seal over in this country. But if you seal it over, you just can't make sense of things going on in the contemporary scene.
I had a question going back to the earlier question about the superhuman. And I feel like you addressed that on the level of power and talking about groups of enemies having superhuman power and othering them that way. I'm interested in conceiving of others as morally superhuman.
Yeah.
So I'm coming at this mostly from a medieval perspective because that's what I do. So I'm thinking of like saints and relics of saints and things and how that connects to these souvenirs of people that are being lynched. But I'm also thinking of it in the modern, when we talk about, like the way we talk about certain people, for example, I notice this especially with trans women, but I know that it happens in other places, but we talk about, especially Black trans women, when they're people we like, we talk about them as goddesses.
Yeah.
We don't use human words anymore.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if in circumstances like that, or in talking about saints in the medieval, do we still wind up creating creepiness? Do we still create some kind of a monster?
Okay, that's a really, really good question. And it's something, all right, so I was in the museum this morning, and we were looking at religious art. We went through the Egyptian rooms and looked at Indian art and so on. And religious art often represents the divine as chimeras, as really odd fusions. Yeah, that's right. Or people with lots of arms, or fusions of human beings and boars and things like that. There is a certain amount of literature on this. Mary Douglas touches on this sort of territory. And it's something I really want to think about much more deeply, but I haven't yet. I mean, in both cases, there is something which we could call, in a very coarse-grained way, unnatural, right? There is the divine unnatural, supernatural, and there's the creepy unnatural, the monstrous. They're united by something, and both are charged with tremendous power, I think, precisely because they transgress the normal metaphysical boundaries. So there's, oddly enough, some important common ground there.
Yeah.
And of course, in some religious systems, in some particularly indigenous religious systems, the difference is not so stark. So deities are dangerous, malevolent things that need to be appeased.
Yeah, there's a collapsing distinction between like the superhuman and the subhuman, and it's all just this super. It's not even supernatural. It's the natural.
It's just outside of the the mundane system of categories. Yeah,
exactly. Cool. Anyone?
Hey, so it seemed like you were saying that with your newer work that the aspect of dehumanization, which results in making people out to be like monsters, is like is a side effect. What they would like to do is just treat them like animals.
Yeah.
Right. If they could just do that, then that would be easier for them.
Yeah.
But they can't do that, so they make them like monsters, and that seems like makes perfect sense in terms of instances of colonialization or slavery. But what about with like anti-Semitism? Because there it seems like it's more just that they wanted to make them this monstrous other from the get-go. And maybe that's just because I don't know the history of it so much.
I think anti-Semitism is actually a very good case.
But it doesn't seem like there's a, like where in that case are they just trying to make them out to be animals, and then they can't do that, and so they end up being
vermin, they're lice,
Okay.
that was the Nazi anti-Semitic literature was just infused with that sort of stuff, right? And here's the paradox: they're rats, and they're a uniquely formidable, uniquely evil enemy that must be destroyed. The fate of the whole world hangs in the balance. So that's the, that's the superhumanization.
Okay, I see.
Right?
Yeah.
The monstrousness, the demoniacal quality of.
Would you say that in that instance, is it still that the monstrous? That's I mean, because it seems like that's what the propagandists wanted from the first, from the start, right? Is to have them be a sort of demonic entity, right? Or is that not the case?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think not, but your question makes me reconsider that. Actually,
it's very interesting to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
See the view, so I can see who else is. Oh, thank you. Did we get everyone's question? All right. Let's please, you all obviously got something out of it, and I certainly did as well. So let's take another moment and thank our excellent speaker.
Thank you. Thank you.